May 13, 1945, Mother's Day. The war in Europe had just ended 5 days earlier. Allied forces were closing in on Japan. But for 24 American servicemen and women stationed at Hollandia in Dutch New Guinea, this Sunday morning promised something different. A break from the grind of war. A chance to see one of the most spectacular, mysterious places on Earth. They called it Shangri-La. Hidden deep in the interior of New Guinea, surrounded by jagged peaks that rose 15,000 feet into tropical clouds, lay a valley that seemed to exist outside of time itself. A valley where over 100,000 people lived exactly as their ancestors had for thousands of years. A Stone Age civilization that the modern world had only discovered 7 years earlier. What happened that day would become one of the most remarkable survival stories of World War II. A story of courage, endurance, and an impossible rescue mission that defied all odds. This is the true story of the Gremlin Special. The Douglas C-47 Skytrain, affectionately nicknamed the Gremlin Special by her crew, sat on the tarmac at Sintani Drome near Hollandia that Sunday morning. She was a workhorse of the war, a twin-engine transport plane that had carried troops, supplies, and wounded soldiers across every theater of the Pacific. But today, she'd carry something different: dreamers and thrill-seekers. Colonel Peter J. Prosson, the maintenance chief of the Far East Air Service Command, had organized this trip. He'd been over the Hidden Valley himself and knew what an incredible sight it was. Word had spread through the base about this mysterious valley. Rumors of primitive tribes, of warriors who'd never seen white men, of a land untouched by the 20th century. 24 people signed up for the flight. Among them was Corporal Margaret Hastings, a 29-year-old secretary from Owego, New York. Margaret, or Maggie as her friends called her, had enlisted in the Women's Army Corps in January 1944. She was smart, capable, and adventurous, exactly the kind of young woman who'd jump at the chance to see Shangri-La. Also aboard was Lieutenant John McCollum, a tough, level-headed officer who'd seen his share of action. His twin brother Robert had signed up for the flight too. The McCollum twins were inseparable. Staff Sergeant Kenneth Decker, Technical Sergeant Laura Besley, Private Eleanor Hanna, and 19 others climbed aboard. They were excited, laughing, taking pictures. Some had cameras. Others just wanted to see this lost world with their own eyes. At the controls sat Colonel Prosson himself, with Major George Nicholson as his co-pilot. They'd made this run before. They knew the route: fly south from Hollandia, navigate through the mountain passes, drop down into the valley where they could get close enough to see the villages and the people below, then climb back out and return to base. Simple, a milk run. At approximately 9 a.m., the Gremlin Special's engines roared to life. The C-47 lifted off into the tropical morning sky. For the first hour, the flight was everything they'd hoped for. They flew over dense, unbroken jungle, a green carpet that stretched to every horizon. Mountain peaks jutted up through blankets of clouds. It was beautiful, primeval, absolutely unlike anything most of them had ever seen. Then, ahead, the valley appeared. The Hidden Valley, or Baliem Valley, as explorer Richard Archbold had named it when he discovered it from the air in 1938, was breathtaking. 40 miles long, 8 miles wide, a flat expanse of brilliant green nestled between those towering peaks. And everywhere, signs of human habitation. Neat fields laid out in geometric patterns. Circular thatched roof huts clustered in villages. Tiny figures moving through the fields below. Colonel Prosson banked the aircraft and descended. He wanted to give his passengers a good look. They pressed against the windows, pointing, taking pictures, marveling at this world that seemed frozen in time. They swooped lower, lower still. Some of the passengers later said they could see individual people looking up at them. Warriors with spears, women tending gardens, children running. No one knows exactly what happened next. Maybe it was the clouds that suddenly rolled in, obscuring the mountain walls. Maybe it was a downdraft, those sudden violent air currents that plague mountainous terrain. Maybe Colonel Prosson had simply flown too low, too confident in his knowledge of the valley. What we know is this: at approximately 10:30 a.m., The Gremlin Special was making its descent back toward the valley floor when disaster struck. The massive wall of a mountain, its peak hidden in cloud, appeared directly in their path. There was no time, no room to maneuver, no chance to pull up. The C-47 slammed into the mountainside at over 150 miles per hour. Lieutenant John McCollum would later recall the moment. He was sitting in the back of the plane when he felt the impact. The sound was deafening, the screech of tearing metal, the roar of exploding fuel. The tail section of the plane sheared completely off. Fire erupted instantly throughout the fuselage. McCollum looked around in horror. Bodies everywhere, fire everywhere. His brother Robert was dead, killed instantly. Colonel Prosson, dead. Major Nicholson, dead. Smoke filled what was left of the cabin. "Get out!" someone screamed. "Get out! She's gonna blow!" McCollum stumbled toward where he thought a door should be. His hands were burned, his face was cut, but he could move. Behind him he heard another voice, a woman's voice. "Help me! Please, somebody help me!" It was Corporal Margaret Hastings. She was trapped in her seat, surrounded by flames, with severe burns on her legs. Despite his own injuries, McCollum turned back. He yanked her free and dragged her through the twisted wreckage. Staff Sergeant Kenneth Decker, his head bleeding profusely from a gash, his right arm clearly broken, somehow managed to crawl out on his own. Together, these three, McCollum, Hastings, and Decker, pulled themselves away from the inferno. Behind them, the Gremlin Special exploded. When they'd gotten far enough away to be safe, when the initial shock began to wear off, they realized two others had made it out alive. Staff Sergeant Laura Besley and Private First Class Eleanor Hanna. Both were critically injured. Burns covered their bodies. They were barely conscious. 5 survivors out of 24. McCollum took stock of their situation, and what he saw wasn't good. They were on a mountainside at approximately 12,000 feet. They had no radio, no supplies except the clothes on their backs. The nearest base was over 150 miles away across some of the most treacherous terrain on Earth. 2 of their group were dying, and they had no idea if anyone even knew they'd crashed. The crash had made a tremendous noise and sent up a huge column of black smoke. But up here, in the clouds, who would see it? As night fell on that first day, the temperature dropped dramatically. They had no shelter, no fire, no blankets. Laura Besley and Eleanor Hanna lay dying, crying out in pain. There was nothing anyone could do for them. Both women died the next morning, May 14th. Now there were 3 survivors in a land that time forgot, surrounded by mountains, by jungle, by people who'd never seen a white person before. 3 survivors who had no food, no clean water, and severe injuries. Lieutenant John McCollum was 31 years old. His brother was dead. Most of his friends were dead. But he was the ranking officer, and that meant these 2 people, Margaret Hastings and Kenneth Decker, were his responsibility. He looked down at the valley below, that green expanse that had seemed so beautiful just hours before. Now it might be their only chance at survival. "We need to get down there," he said. "We need to get to where search planes can see us. We need to move." Have you ever tried to walk down a steep hill with a broken ankle? Now imagine doing it with severe burns covering your legs, or with a broken arm and a head wound while you're dehydrated, exhausted, and in shock. And instead of a hill, it's a near-vertical jungle-covered mountainside in New Guinea. That's what these 3 faced. The descent took them 2 days. 2 days of crawling through dense undergrowth, of sliding down muddy slopes, of fighting through vines and thorns. Every step was agony for Margaret Hastings. The burns on her legs had become infected almost immediately in the tropical heat. Decker's broken arm swung uselessly at his side. McCollum, relatively uninjured compared to the others, took the lead, helping them when they fell, which was often. They had no food except what they could scavenge. McCollum found some wild bananas. They chewed on leaves to get moisture. The jungle was full of sounds, strange bird calls, the rustle of unseen animals, the buzz of insects that descended on them in clouds. And always the fear. The fear that they'd die out here. The fear that no one was looking for them. The fear of what might be waiting for them in that valley below. Because the rumors they'd heard weren't entirely wrong. The Dani people who lived in the hidden valley weren't just peaceful farmers. They were warriors. Different tribes within the valley had been fighting each other for generations. They carried spears and arrows. And yes, some of the neighboring tribes were known to practice cannibalism. What would these Stone Age people do when they encountered the survivors? On the second day of their descent, as they pushed through another wall of jungle growth, they suddenly emerged into a clearing. And there, not 50 yards away, was a cluster of round, thatched roof huts, a Dani village. The three Americans froze. And from the huts, the Dani emerged. Men mostly, carrying spears. They wore penis gourds called kotekas and little else. Their bodies were decorated with clay and feathers. They stared at these strange, pale creatures with wonder and, perhaps, suspicion. For a long moment, nobody moved. Then, Margaret Hastings, despite her pain, despite everything, smiled and raised her hand in greeting. One of the Dani men stepped forward. He didn't raise his spear. Instead, he smiled back. What happened next would prove to be the first of many miracles in this story. The Dani people, far from being hostile, were curious and helpful. They'd seen the plane crash. The smoke and fire had been visible for miles. They'd heard the terrible sounds. Now here were survivors, badly hurt, clearly in need of help. The Dani brought the Americans to their village. They gave them sweet potatoes and pork, the staples of their diet. They provided shelter in their Honai huts, which were warm and dry. Most importantly, they didn't harm them. Through gestures and simple communication, a kind of understanding developed. The Dani understood that these strangers had fallen from the sky. The Americans understood that these people, despite living in the Stone Age, were intelligent, organized, and remarkably kind. But there was still the question of rescue. Back at Hollandia, the Gremlin Special had been reported missing almost immediately when she failed to return. The problem was, Colonel Prossen's flight plan had simply said Shangri-La, with no coordinates, no specific route. The searchers knew the plane had gone down somewhere in the interior, but New Guinea's interior was vast, mostly uncharted, and covered in dense jungle and clouds. Search planes went up immediately, flying grid patterns over the mountains. But day after day, they found nothing. The wreckage was hidden in the jungle canopy. The survivors, even in the valley, were nearly impossible to spot from the air. For 3 days, McCollum, Hastings, and Decker waited. They'd managed to reach a more open area of the valley, away from the thick jungle. They tried to make themselves visible, laying out pieces of wreckage, waving brightly colored cloth. But the search planes flew over without seeing them. On the 4th day, May 16th, everything changed. A C-47 search plane, flying lower than usual, made one more pass over the valley. The pilot, determined not to give up, pushed his plane through the cloud layer and dropped down into the valley itself. And there, on the valley floor, he saw them. 3 figures waving frantically. One of them, Margaret Hastings, was waving her red parachute silk. The pilot waggled his wings. Message received. He climbed back out of the valley and radioed back to base. Survivor spotted. Repeat, survivor spotted in Hidden Valley. When the search plane returned an hour later, it dropped a package. Inside was food, medical supplies, and a note. Hang on, help is coming. But how? That was the question that now consumed the military brass back at Hollandia. They'd found the survivors, that was the good news. The bad news? There was no way to get them out. There was no place to land a plane. The valley was surrounded by 15,000-foot peaks. There were no roads, no trails. The survivors couldn't walk out, not with their injuries, not across that terrain. And the Japanese still controlled parts of the island. It was, quite simply, impossible. The decision was made to send in a medical rescue team by parachute. On May 26th, 13 days after the crash, 2 medics from the U.S. Army's 1st Filipino Infantry Regiment volunteered to jump into the valley. Their names were Sergeants Hermenegildo Don Sorozo and Camilo Ramirez. Both were experienced paratroopers, but neither had ever jumped into terrain like this. They knew the risks. The valley was ringed with mountains. Wind currents were treacherous. The drop zone was rough and uneven. And once they jumped, there would be no easy way out. They'd be stuck there with the survivors until command figured out a rescue plan. Bahala na, they said, using their unit's motto. It meant, come what may. They jumped. Both men landed safely, though hard. Within hours, they'd reached the survivors and begun administering medical care. They cleaned and dressed Margaret Hastings' infected burns. They set Kenneth Decker's broken arm properly. They provided antibiotics and pain medication. Over the next few days, 10 more Filipino-American paratroopers jumped in to establish a base camp and provide security. The survivors were safe now, or as safe as they could be, but they were still trapped. Supply drops came regularly. C-47s would fly over and push out packages with parachutes. Food, medicine, blankets, tools, even phonograph records and playing cards to keep spirits up. The drop zones weren't perfect, and some supplies ended up in trees or rivers, but enough got through. The Dani continued to be fascinated by all this. They'd help retrieve supplies. They'd trade with the Americans, pork and sweet potatoes for the colorful parachute silk and the cowrie shells that the Americans had started including in the drops specifically for trade. A remarkable friendship developed. The Americans learned that the Dani were farmers and warriors, that they lived in a complex society with its own rules and customs, that they raised pigs as prized possessions, and that their warfare with other tribes was more ritualized than the Americans initially thought. The Dani learned that these sky people were friendly, that they had amazing technology, and that they needed help. But the question remained, how to get everyone out? Meanwhile, back in the United States, this story was becoming front-page news. The American press had gotten wind of the crash and the survival of 3 Americans in a lost valley with headhunters. They particularly focused on Margaret Hastings, the only woman, a WWII corporal, beautiful and brave, trapped in the jungle. Headlines screamed, WWII corporal lost in Shangri-La. Woman survives crash in Headhunter Valley. Queen of Shangri-La awaits rescue. Margaret hated the attention, but she understood it. People back home needed good news. The war in Europe was won, but boys were still dying in the Pacific. This story of survival against impossible odds, of Stone Age people helping modern Americans, of courage and hope, this was the kind of story America needed. But the brass at Hollandia had a problem. The media coverage meant that failure wasn't an option. They had to get these people out. The whole world was watching. And that's when Colonel Edward T. Imparato, commander of the 374th Troop Carrier Group, had an idea. An absolutely crazy idea. Gliders. The Waco CG-4A glider was designed to be towed behind a C-47, released over enemy territory, and land silently to deliver troops and supplies. It could carry 13 combat-equipped soldiers or a jeep. It was essentially a canvas and wood aircraft with no engine. Colonel Imparato's plan was simple in concept, but insane in execution. Have a glider pilot fly into the valley, land on a makeshift runway that the paratroopers would build, load up survivors, and then have a C-47 perform what was called a snatch pickup, hooking the glider's tow line while flying low and fast, yanking it back into the air. This maneuver had been tested before, but never in terrain like this. Never in a valley surrounded by 15,000-foot peaks with unpredictable wind currents. Never with injured civilians aboard. But it was the only option. The paratroopers and Filipino laborers, with help from the Dani, went to work building a landing strip. They cleared a narrow stretch of rough ground, filled in holes, removed rocks and stumps. It wasn't much. barely 600 feet long on uneven terrain surrounded by obstacles. But it would have to do. June 28, 1945, 47 days after the crash. The first glider came in at dawn, piloted by Lieutenant Henry Palmer. The tow plane, a C-47, released the glider at altitude, and Palmer guided it down through the mountain passes, fighting wind currents every foot of the way. He'd have one chance to land on that tiny strip. The glider dropped through clouds, and the valley floor rushed up. Palmer lined up on the strip. The glider was coming in too fast. Trees loomed on either side. The ground was rough and uneven. The glider hit hard, bounced, hit again, and skidded to a stop just 30 feet from the end of the runway. Perfect. Palmer climbed out and grinned at the waiting survivors. Anybody call for a taxi? The plan was to evacuate them in groups. Margaret Hastings and 2 medics went first. They climbed aboard the glider and strapped in. Palmer ran through his checklist. Everything was ready. Now came the hard part. A C-47 flew over the valley at low altitude, trailing a long tow rope with a loop at the end. On the ground, the glider's own tow rope had been raised up on poles, forming an arch that the C-47's rope could snag. The C-47 pilot, flying at 150 miles per hour, had to hook that loop on his first pass. There would be no second chance. If he missed or if the snatch failed, the glider would be stuck and everyone aboard would have to wait for another attempt. The C-47 roared down the valley, so low that the Dani people watching ran for cover. The tow plane's hook caught the glider's rope. There was a tremendous jolt. The glider lurched forward, then shot into the air, climbing at a steep angle. Inside, Margaret Hastings held on for dear life. The glider shook violently. Wind screamed through the canvas. They were being towed straight up, climbing to get over the mountain peaks that surrounded the valley. But there was a problem. During the snatch, a parachute from an earlier supply drop had gotten tangled in the glider's tow line. The parachute was acting like a giant air brake, creating drag, making it nearly impossible for the C-47 to gain altitude. They were going to crash. Lieutenant McCollum, who was watching from the ground, saw what was happening. He'd been in the glider's tail section, and when he saw the parachute snag, he'd climbed out to the back of the aircraft while it was in flight, cut the parachute free, and pulled it inside. The glider immediately shot upward. The C-47 pilot regained control. They climbed over the peaks and headed for home. 1 hour and 20 minutes later, they landed at Hollandia, safe. 2 MART trips were made that day. Kenneth Decker and the remaining medics came out on the second flight. John McCollum, who'd insisted on being last, came out on the third flight along with the remaining paratroopers. All 3 survivors were safe. All the rescuers were safe. Not a single person had been lost during the rescue operation. 47 days after crashing into a mountainside in one of the most remote places on Earth, the survivors of the Gremlin Special were home. The story of the Gremlin Special made headlines around the world. Margaret Hastings became a celebrity, though she never wanted the attention. At her first press conference after the rescue, when reporters asked her what she wanted most, she smiled and said, "I'd like a shower and a permanent." She never spoke much about the ordeal afterward. Neither did John McCollum or Kenneth Decker. They'd survived something that should have killed them. They'd been helped by people from a completely different world. They'd been rescued by one of the most daring operations in military history. 21 people died when the Gremlin Special crashed into that mountain. The paratroopers who jumped in to help had erected 20 crosses and 1 Star of David at the crash site before they left, marking the graves of those who hadn't made it. The Dani people went back to their lives, though the story of the Sky people who crashed in their valley became part of their oral history. The valley itself remained largely isolated for years after the war, though eventually roads and an airport came to Wamena, the main town. Margaret Hastings lived until 2007. She was 93 when she died. She never forgot the Dani people who helped her, the paratroopers who risked their lives to save her, or the terrible price of that Mother's Day pleasure flight. John McCollum lived to be 90. He carried his brother's memory with him every day. Years later, he would say that the crash taught him something important. When you have no choice, you have no fear. You just do what needs to be done. That's survival. That's what it means to be human. The wreckage of the Gremlin Special still lies on that mountainside, slowly being reclaimed by the jungle. It's a memorial now to those who died and those who lived, to a moment when the modern world and the Stone Age collided, and to the remarkable fact that sometimes, against all odds, people survive. Sometimes, even in the darkest moments, there are miracles. This has been the true story of the Gremlin Special. Remember their names: Margaret Hastings, John McCollum, Kenneth Decker, and the 21 who didn't make it home. They flew into paradise and fell into hell, but they survived. And their story reminds us that courage, kindness, and hope can exist even in the most impossible circumstances. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this incredible true story, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more untold stories from history. Share this video with anyone who loves tales of survival, courage, and the indomitable human spirit. What do you think about this remarkable rescue mission? Have you heard of the Gremlin Special before? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. We love hearing from you. The survivors of this crash went on to live full lives, but they never forgot those 47 days in the Hidden Valley, or the people, both American and Dani, who made their survival possible. Their story is a testament to what humans can endure and achieve when they refuse to give up. Don't forget to check out the links in the description below for more information about the Gremlin Special, the Dani people of the Baliem Valley, and the brave Filipino-American paratroopers of the 1st Filipino Infantry Regiment who risked everything for this rescue. If you want to learn more about incredible World War II stories like this one, check out our playlist in the cards above. From forgotten battles to unsung heroes, we bring history to life. Thanks again for watching, and remember, history isn't just about the battles we won or lost. It's about the people who lived through them, their courage, their sacrifice, their humanity. Until next time, stay curious, stay inspired, and never stop exploring the amazing true stories that shaped our world.